Have you ever walked into a room you've known for years, a place that felt like your second home, only to realize in a single heartbeat that you no longer belong? It's a strange, cold feeling, isn't it? As if the very walls have turned their back on you. For me, it began with a late-night meeting invitation. The subject line contained just 2 words: transition planning. In that moment, I knew. 15 years of my career, of early mornings and late nights, of building something that mattered, was about to be formally concluded in a 30-minute meeting I wasn't meant to walk away from. So if you're watching this right now, maybe in your car, maybe on your lunch break, just tell me one thing. Where are you listening from? Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to know how far this story travels. And if something in you recognizes something in this, stay with me. My name is Sarah Collins, and for 15 years as the Director of Supply Chain Operations, I had built my reputation on a single, unwavering principle. Logic can solve anything. It can find a truck in a snowstorm, reroute a critical shipment around a flood, and build a network of partners based on mutual trust, not just contractual obligation. Logic was my shield and my sword, but as I walked down the hallway to that conference room, I had a feeling that logic was about to be dismissed from the conversation entirely. The hallway was quieter than usual, the kind of heavy silence that makes you conscious of your own breathing. I paused at the door, which was slightly ajar. Inside, I could see the scene already laid out like a carefully staged play. There was the new Chief Executive Officer, Jordan Trent, a man who seemed younger than his polished reputation. He was impeccably dressed, his focus entirely on a leather-bound folder in front of him, as if it contained truths more important than the person about to enter the room. He didn't look up. Across from him, my mentee, Jason, was pouring himself a cup of coffee. It was from the pot I had brought in every Monday for the last 10 years. He saw me, I know he did, but his eyes quickly darted back to the dark liquid filling his cup. The third person at the table was the head of human resources. She offered a small, tight nod as I entered. It wasn't a greeting, it was an acknowledgement, the kind of gesture you make when a final, non-negotiable step in a process has just been initiated. I let the silence hang in the air for a moment longer than was comfortable, letting them feel the weight of my presence one last time before I took the only available seat. It was a spare chair, brought in from another room. The back was loose, and it sat just an inch lower than the others, forcing me to look up slightly at the people who had already decided my fate. It was a small detail, but it was intentional. The human resources manager began to speak, her voice steady and detached as she read from a prepared document. I recognized the language immediately. It was the sanitized, impersonal dialect of corporate change. Words like restructuring and streamlining and a more scalable future were deployed like surgical instruments, designed to remove a part of the organization without leaving a trace of emotion. I glanced over at Jason. He was no longer drinking his coffee. He was folding a paper napkin into smaller and smaller squares, his hands desperate for a task to perform. I had taught him how to read a logistics map, how to calm a panicked driver at 3 a.m, how to earn the trust of suppliers who valued a handshake more than a contract. Now, he couldn't even meet my gaze. Finally, Jordan Trent closed his folder. The sound was crisp, final. He looked at me for the first time, his eyes clear and devoid of any discernible emotion. "Sarah," he said, his voice even, "we are grateful for your years of service, but as we move toward a more data-driven operational model, we are realigning our leadership." It was a perfect corporate eulogy. I wasn't being fired for failure. I was being made obsolete by a new philosophy. He slid an envelope across the table. My name was on it, printed from a label maker. No plaque, no handshake, just a tidy package of severance and legal documents. He thought it was over. He asked if there were any final questions before we proceeded, and I had one. The one question that would ultimately unravel everything he was trying to build. I drew a slow, deliberate breath, letting the stale conference room air fill my lungs. My gaze didn't shift to the chief executive officer, nor to the man I had trained. Instead, I looked down at the glossy document resting on the polished table. I extended a single finger, gently sliding the folder to face Jordan Trent directly. My movements were calm, measured, showing none of the turbulence I felt inside. Years of crisis management, of finding solutions in chaos, had taught me how to anchor myself in the eye of a storm. "I do have one question," I said, my voice as even as his had been. "It's regarding the new supplier agreement framework, specifically Clause 7.4, Automated Cost Optimization." I paused, letting the corporate jargon hang in the air. I saw a flicker of annoyance in Jordan's eyes. This was not part of his script. He had expected silence, a quiet acceptance, a defeated signature on a legal document. He had not expected a discussion about the fine print. I was no longer an employee to be managed. I was a loose end he had failed to tie up neatly. Before he could respond, I continued, my tone shifting to a statement of fact. That clause gives the system unilateral authority to switch suppliers based on real-time cost bidding, overriding established relationships. On paper, it looks efficient. In practice, during a flood or a sudden freeze, it's our smaller, more loyal partners who answer the phone at midnight. Their flexibility, built on years of trust, has kept our lines moving when larger, automated systems failed. This clause mistakes loyalty for inefficiency. It will systematically sever the relationships that have become our company's most resilient, unlisted asset. I did not raise my voice. I did not plead. I simply stated the logical consequence of his new philosophy, an outcome his charts and spreadsheets could never predict. Jason was now staring at his hands as if he had never seen them before. The human resources manager cleared her throat, a tiny, nervous sound in the heavy silence. Jordan Trent, however, leaned back in his chair. A slow, thin smile touched his lips, but it never reached his eyes. It was a smile of validation, not amusement. I had just handed him the very proof he needed to justify his decision. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, and the politeness was more insulting than any outburst could have been. "You've just perfectly articulated the exact legacy thinking this transition is designed to move us beyond. Your concern for those individual relationships is precisely the bottleneck we need to eliminate to achieve scale." He leaned forward again, the smile vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "Your hesitation to embrace a more efficient future confirms that our decision is the correct one." He looked at the head of human resources. "We're done here." Then his eyes returned to me, cold and final. "Your services are no longer required, effective immediately." I stood up slowly, my movements unhurried. I picked up the envelope with my name on it. My hands were perfectly steady. I had given them my logic, my experience, my final warning. They had given me a termination notice. It was, in its own way, a fair exchange. I turned and walked out without a backward glance. My network access was terminated before I even reached the parking lot. They thought they had erased me. They hadn't realized I had built my own private archive years ago for a day just like this. That private archive wasn't a physical object, not a hidden notebook or a secret hard drive. It was a space I had meticulously crafted over the years, an encrypted personal ledger shielded from the corporate network. It was my intellectual property, built on my own time, because I learned early in my career that a company's memory is often short and selective. I had seen good people, mentors of mine, erased by new management who saw their experience not as an asset, but as an expense. A company remembers profits and losses, but it quickly forgets the favors, the handshake agreements, and the human context that true partnerships are built on. They had cut my access, but they could not access my memory. That night, there was no anger, no grief. The time for emotion would come later. Instead, a profound and quiet focus settled over me. I didn't pack a box of desk ornaments or water my office plant. I sat at my home desk, the only light in the house coming from the cool glow of the monitor, and for the next several hours, I performed a quiet migration. Each entry was a memory, a piece of unwritten history that had kept the gears of our supply chain turning smoothly when everything on paper said they should have ceased. I entered the details of the small family-owned trucking firm in Ohio. The patriarch had passed away 2 years prior, and I had worked with his daughter to restructure their routes, giving them less profitable but more consistent loads to keep them afloat during their transition. This was not in any contract. It was a bridge built of empathy, and it had earned us an unwavering loyalty that money could not buy. A loyalty that resulted in them taking an emergency shipment for us on Christmas Eve when no one else would. I chronicled the unwritten rule that for one of our most critical suppliers, all major decisions had to be discussed over the phone, never in an email, because the owner was old school and believed a person's word was their bond. This was the data Jordan Trent's new system could never hope to quantify. It was the art that surrounded the science of logistics, the human element that he had so carelessly dismissed as a bottleneck. As I saved the final entry, a sense of calm closure washed over me. I had preserved my life's work. My phone buzzed on the desk beside me, pulling me from my thoughts. It was a personal email from my former assistant, a young woman I had mentored. The message was sent late and contained only a single chilling line. "They're already looking for your relationship files. I told them I didn't know what they were talking about." I felt a small, fierce pulse of gratitude for her courage. She was risking her own standing to give me a warning. They were already feeling the void. They just didn't know what shape it had. With my own legacy secured, I turned to my final task. I opened my personal email and began to write. One by one, I composed 37 individual messages to the key partners I had cultivated over 15 years. There was no mention of my termination, no hint of bitterness. They were simple, professional notes of gratitude, wishing them continued success and providing my private contact information should they ever need clarification on past work. It was a clean break, an act of closure. I sent the last email just before dawn. I didn't know that one of them, a simple courtesy, would be forwarded to the new man in my chair, Mark, and would be misinterpreted as the first move in a war I had no intention of fighting. For 3 days, there was only silence. The relentless rhythm that had governed my life for 15 years, the pre-dawn calls from the East Coast, the late-night texts from the West, had vanished. My mornings were no longer a race against the clock, but a slow, unfolding quiet that felt foreign and unsettling. I told myself this was the peace I had earned, a respite from the constant, low-grade hum of responsibility. But it didn't feel like peace. It felt like the unnerving calm in the air just before a storm makes landfall. I was waiting not for a call, but for the first tremor, the first sign that the structure I had so carefully maintained was beginning to feel my absence. It came on a Thursday afternoon. A number flashed on my screen that I knew by heart, one belonging to a supplier named Carl. He ran a small freight company out of Michigan, a crucial link in our Midwest corridor. He was a man of his word, whose loyalty had been forged through blizzards and breakdowns, not quarterly reviews. I answered, my voice calm, but my stomach tightened. "Sarah?" he asked, and the weariness in his tone told me more than any report could. "I'm sorry to bother you at home. I know you've stepped away, but I've run into a situation here, and it doesn't make a lick of sense." I listened as he explained. A machine part for a major client was arriving ahead of schedule, and he needed to adjust his pickup window by 3 hours. A simple, common request we had accommodated countless times to save on storage fees. He had spoken to Mark, my replacement. Mark had refused, citing the new automated scheduling system. When Carl calmly reminded him of our long-standing verbal agreement to prioritize critical parts, Mark had apparently been dismissive. But it was what happened next that prompted Carl's call to me. "He followed up with an email, Sarah," Carl said, his voice now tight with a quiet, simmering anger. "I'm reading it to you verbatim. While we appreciate your long history with the company, any previous verbal understanding is considered an undocumented and therefore invalid arrangement. All scheduling must adhere to the new system protocols." Carl went silent for a moment. "An invalid arrangement, 15 years of working through holidays, of making impossible deadlines happen, and he calls it an invalid arrangement." It wasn't satisfaction I felt as I listened. It was a deep, hollow ache, the sound of a well-oiled machine beginning to grind its gears, just as I had predicted. The new philosophy wasn't just inefficient, it was insulting. It was erasing history. It was telling good people that their loyalty had no value if it couldn't be quantified in a spreadsheet. I kept my voice steady, empathetic. "I'm very sorry to hear that, Carl, but as you know, I'm no longer with the company. There's nothing I can do." It was the truth, but it felt like a betrayal to say it. I know," he sighed. I had to make sure I wasn't going crazy." We spoke for another minute, a polite and sad exchange between two old partners who now stood on opposite sides of a wall that had been built overnight. As we were saying our goodbyes, he paused. "Oh, and Sarah, there's one more thing. I only knew to call Mark because when I emailed your old address first, out of habit, he's the one who replied." He let that sink in. "Did you know your corporate email is still active? It's just being redirected." The line went dead, but I kept the phone pressed to my ear for a long time, listening to the empty silence. Redirected. The word echoed in my mind. It was one thing to be dismissed and erased. It was another thing entirely to become a ghost whose conversations were being secretly monitored. My departure was no longer a simple termination. It had become an intelligence-gathering operation. They weren't just moving on without me. They were actively watching the space I had left behind, listening for my echo. A cold knot formed in my stomach. This was no longer about a new business philosophy. This was about paranoia. The next morning, the first official move was made. An automated email appeared in my personal inbox, its subject line sterile and unnerving. Notification of standard procedure, asset security audit. It informed me that, as part of a routine process for all departing leadership, a full security audit of my former accounts and network activity was being initiated to ensure the integrity of corporate assets. I read it twice. There was nothing routine about this. This was a search party, sent into the digital woods to find the trail of a person they believed had taken something vital with her. They were looking for the relationship files my assistant had warned me about, and when they couldn't find them, they decided to build a case that I had maliciously hidden or destroyed them. It was a classic corporate tactic. When faced with a problem you don't understand, invent a security threat and blame the person who is no longer there to defend herself. They were trying to retroactively justify my dismissal, to paint me not as obsolete, but as a liability. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching a clumsy chess match between players who could only see one move ahead. Their strategy was so transparent, so predictable. They were reacting to a loss of control, and their first instinct was to create a narrative where they were the victims of a betrayal, not the architects of a colossal mistake. The final piece of their strategy arrived that afternoon. It was another forwarded email from a quiet ally inside the company, sent without a single word of commentary. The original message was from the Information Technology Department, addressed to the entire company. The subject was, "A note on protecting our intellectual property." I read the carefully crafted paragraphs, which spoke of the importance of safeguarding our proprietary methods and the implementation of new, stricter protocols during employee transitions. It never mentioned my name. It didn't have to. Every single person who read it would know who the unnamed subject was. It was a public branding, an attempt to poison my legacy from within. Staring at the memo on my screen, I felt no anger. The emotion that rose up was something far colder, far clearer. It was contempt. Not for the insult, but for the sheer incompetence of the move. This wasn't a show of strength. It was a public declaration of fear. They were so terrified of the questions my absence was creating that they had to invent a villain. They were building a case against a ghost, but their hunt for my digital footprints was about to lead them straight to a landmine I hadn't even planted. I didn't have to wait long. The landmine I spoke of was not some forgotten file or a hidden email chain. It was something far simpler. It was their own arrogance packaged and delivered by a third party. It arrived 2 days later, not as a digital notification, but as a physical object. A courier stood at my front door, holding a crisp, legal-sized envelope and a clipboard, asking for my signature. The return address was that of a prestigious, expensive law firm downtown. I signed the electronic pad, my hand steady, and took the envelope. It felt heavy in my hands, weighted with the importance its senders had placed upon it. I walked into my kitchen and opened it with a letter opener, slicing the thick paper with a clean, satisfying slit. Inside was a multi-page document printed on heavy, watermarked bond paper. The language was cold, precise, and thick with legal terminology designed to intimidate. It accused me of unauthorized engagement with current business partners and potential tortious interference with contractual relationships. It was a masterpiece of corporate aggression, a document that twisted my acts of professional courtesy into a malicious campaign of sabotage. It demanded, in no uncertain terms, that I cease and desist all communication immediately. I read through the dense paragraphs, my mind not processing the threats, but rather analyzing the strategy behind them. This was Jordan Trent's definitive move to isolate me. By creating a legal threat, he was attempting to sever my final connections to the world I had built, to frighten me into a silence he could then control. He was escalating the conflict from the realm of internal memos and veiled accusations into the stark, unforgiving world of legal action. It was a bold move. It was also an incredibly foolish one. My eyes drifted to the bottom of the final page, just below the sweeping, illegible signature of the firm's senior partner. There, under the heading CC, was a short list of 3 names. They were not lawyers. They were the chief executive officers of 3 of our most critical long-term suppliers, including Carl's parent company. My breath caught for a single sharp instant. This letter wasn't just for me. It was a warning shot, fired across the bow of their own partners. It was a message of intimidation, a declaration that associating with me would put them in the company's crosshairs. A strange, quiet clarity settled over me. There was no fear, no anger, not even surprise. It was the crystalline moment in a game of chess when you see your opponent make a fatal, irreversible error. In their desperate attempt to build a wall around me, they had just handed my allies the bricks and mortar to build a fortress of their own. They had taken their paranoia, their disrespect, their bad faith, and they had certified it with a lawyer's signature. I folded the letter neatly along its original creases, the paper cool and smooth beneath my fingertips. I placed it in the center of my kitchen counter, a silent testament to their colossal miscalculation. Then I turned and walked away to make a cup of coffee. I did nothing else. I didn't have to. The company had just made the one mistake I never would have. They put their disrespect in writing. The coffee I made that morning tasted unusually bitter. I stood in my kitchen, watching the sun cast long shadows across the floor, my eyes occasionally drifting to the letter on the counter. It lay there, a monument to their hubris. I had done nothing, said nothing. I had not forwarded the letter, nor had I spoken to a single soul about it. I simply waited. I knew the men who had been copied on that document. I had built 15 years of trust with them. I knew their character, and I knew that they would not interpret that letter as a warning. They would interpret it as an insult. The first call came just after 9 o'clock. It was Carl. His voice was different this time. The weary confusion from our last conversation was gone, replaced by a cold, formal resolve. He was no longer a friend calling for advice. He was a professional delivering a verdict. "Sarah," he began, his tone leaving no room for pleasantries. "I'm calling to inform you that as of 10 minutes ago, our parent company has terminated its agreement with your former employer, effective immediately. All of our assets are being rerouted." I listened, my own voice quiet when I finally spoke. "I understand, Carl. Thank you for telling me personally." There was a pause, and then he said something I didn't expect. "No, Sarah, thank you. Our chief executive officer received that letter yesterday afternoon. He said he has never, in his 30 years in this business, seen a company so brazenly threaten its own partners. He said it wasn't a legal issue, it was a character issue." A character issue, the very thing that data-driven models could never account for. The very foundation upon which I had built everything. After we hung up, I didn't feel a sense of victory. I felt a profound gravity, the way you feel when you watch a great tree, old and strong, finally begin to fall. It was the end of a partnership that had weathered recessions and natural disasters, now brought down by a single arrogant email. He was the first domino. An hour later, a text message came from another supplier, the head of a logistics firm in the Southwest. It was a single sentence. "We're out. Good luck, Sarah." Then an email notification popped up on my phone, the subject line stark and unambiguous. "Notice of contract termination." They weren't acting alone. I realized then what Jordan Trent in his insulated boardroom could never understand. He thought the letter would isolate me, marking me as a pariah. Instead, it had done the opposite. It had served as a rallying cry, a piece of undeniable evidence that united them. It proved to them that my quiet departure wasn't a simple restructuring. It was a symptom of a sickness, a rot that had taken hold at the very top of the company. They saw that the disrespect shown to me today would be the disrespect shown to them tomorrow. By noon, I had heard from 2 more. By the end of the day, the number had climbed to 9. They weren't just leaving, they were talking to each other, a quiet and swift rebellion moving through the channels I had spent a decade and a half building. A storm was gathering, and the radar at headquarters was completely, utterly blind. The storm I had foreseen did not pass. It intensified. For another 2 days, I did nothing. My phone remained mostly silent as the initial flurry of departures had given way to a deeper, more ominous quiet. The suppliers who were meant to leave had already left. The ones who remained were now operating in a system with gaping holes, a network that was beginning to fray at the seams. I could picture the chaos unfolding within the walls of that glass building. The frantic calls, the confusing meetings, the frantic search for answers in spreadsheets that could only report the problem, never explain its cause. Then, on Saturday evening, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, a private line with no caller identification. I knew, with a certainty that felt as solid as the ground beneath my feet, who was on the other end. I answered and waited. A man's voice, strained and stripped of its usual commanding tone, spoke my name. It was Jordan Trent. He skipped the pleasantries. He sounded like a man who hadn't slept in days. "We're seeing some significant operational disruptions, Sarah," he began, his voice tight, controlled. "Unexpected vendor non-compliance. I've had my team searching for the supplemental agreements, the ones you must have kept with our key partners, the off-network protocols. We can't find them." His words were telling. He wasn't asking about people, he was asking about paper. He still believed the solution was hidden in a file somewhere, a secret key that would unlock the system. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to sit with the weight of his own misunderstanding. "There are no such files, Jordan," I said finally, my voice calm and even. "There were no off-network protocols. The system you are looking for was never on a server. It was built on conversations and 15 years of trust. You can't audit a memory." The silence on his end was heavier this time. I could hear the faint sound of his breathing, the sound of a man confronting a reality he could no longer deny. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something else, raw, unfiltered desperation. "Then what is it they want?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Is it about new contract terms, better pricing? Just tell me what they want." He was still searching for a transaction, a negotiation he could win with money or power. I knew my next words would be the final turn of the key in a lock he could never open. "They don't want anything from you anymore, Jordan." I said it not with malice, but with the simple, stark finality of a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. This time, the silence was so long I thought he might have hung up. When he finally spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper, the sound of a king who had lost his kingdom and was now begging at the gates. "Would you?" He hesitated, the word catching in his throat. "Would you consider coming back? On a temporary basis, as a consultant, just to help us stabilize?" His question hung in the air, a pathetic last-ditch effort to reclaim some semblance of control. "As a consultant." The words were a quiet admission of his complete and utter failure. He had tried to erase me, to paint me as a threat, and now he was asking me to return and clean up the mess he had made. I felt no triumph, only a quiet pity for a man so blinded by his own philosophy that he couldn't see the ruin he stood in. "I don't believe that would be productive, Jordan," I said, my voice soft but resolute. The trust that was broken wasn't with me. It was with them. I ended the call before he could respond. I expected that to be the end of it. I believed the company, in its wounded state, would retreat and lick its wounds, leaving me to my silence. But the next day, another call came. This time, it was a number I recognized, one I hadn't seen in over a year. It belonged to Arthur Vance, the longest-serving member of the board of directors. He was a man from the old guard, a contemporary of the founder, who believed in balance sheets but also in character. His voice was gravelly, serious, and carried the weight of authority Jordan Trent's never could. "Sarah," he said, dispensing with any formality, "I trust you're well." It wasn't a question, it was a prelude. I'm not calling about the supplier situation. We have the reports, we see the damage. I'm calling about the man who caused it. There was a pause. I need you to tell me exactly what happened from the day of your departure. Give me the timeline. It was then I understood the true nature of the game being played. This wasn't a rescue operation. It was a coroner's inquest. Arthur wasn't asking me to help fix the company. He was asking me to help him document its cause of death, to provide the factual, unvarnished testimony he needed. They weren't trying to rebuild the bridge. They were trying to understand precisely who had detonated the explosives. I can do that, Arthur, I replied, my voice a calm instrument of fact. I would give him the sequence of events, the meeting, the letter, the calls, nothing more. No emotion, no opinion, just the logical progression of their own mistakes. He told me the board was convening for an emergency session that evening. He wasn't asking for my help to save the company. He was asking for a sequence of events, a timeline, for the record. He was gathering the evidence needed to remove a chief executive officer. I sent Arthur the timeline that evening, a simple, factual account of events. I never heard back from him directly, but I didn't need to. A week later, a press release announced that Jordan Trent was stepping down to pursue other opportunities. The company I had given 15 years to was now a ship without a captain, adrift in a storm of its own making. They never asked me to return, and I would not have accepted. The structure itself was flawed, and my presence could not change that. A few weeks later, an email landed in my personal inbox. It was from a smaller, smarter competitor, a company I had always respected for its integrity. The message was short. It didn't offer me a job. It didn't ask me to be a consultant. It simply said, "We're trying to build something that lasts, a system based on people and trust. We heard you know how. Could we buy you a cup of coffee and just listen?" I stared at that message for a long time. It was everything the letter from the lawyers was not. It was an invitation, not a threat. It was an acknowledgement of value, not an accusation. They called the fallout at my old company an unexpected market correction. But I knew what it truly was. It was the price of forgetting that the most valuable assets in any system are the human connections, the loyalty, and the trust that are never listed on a balance sheet.